Hello and welcome to a video on a presentation. This one is Passion, Perfectionism and Mental Health in Olympic Weightlifting. So, I'll talk through a whole presentation for you. Basically, this was my dissertation for my master's, and I've made it into a presentation, and it's just double checking it's recording. And I've given it quite a few times now to coaches, athletes from around the country and from different kind of coach development courses. But I'm going to make it publicly available to obviously to you guys. So here we go. Passion, perfectionism, mental health, Olympic weightlifting. Warning! I put this up because in the original presentations I would talk about myself and mental health stuff. With it. So I weightlift, I did my MSc, I coach, and then the more important thing in terms of this presentation is my mental health background of OCD, psychosis, and depression. Beginning at age 12, diagnosed a few years later. So around age 12 was when I first started having issues with these mental health conditions. And it kind of shaped the way I thought throughout my childhood and my young adulthood. And it was one of the reasons I wanted to get into this topic, passion and perfectionism in Olympic weightlifting. I love weightlifting, obviously, my whole life, but it also probably saved my life as well. So the passion I have for it and the perfectionism, especially from the OCD side, was a big kind of motivating factor to why I did this study. I'm very interested in extreme ways of thinking, so black and white bias, which is quite a common kind of cognition in the kind of CBT world. So having this, something happens to you and you think either the best or the worst. You don't think about what probably is reality, which is somewhere in the middle. You immediately assume best or worst. Now, we'll talk briefly about Johnny Wilkinson, and another kind of motivating factor for it was when I was reading up on, athletes who showed an extreme level of perfectionism, his name kept coming up. So, Johnny Wilkinson was a rugby player, and in 2003, he helped England win the World Cup by kicking a drop goal. Now, it's the only time England have ever won the World Cup. It was by far England's best team ever, and obviously he is up there with the best ever. He's in the conversation for best player ever. Obviously, you can't ever objectify that really, but he's right up there. And it was quite well known that he would spend hours and hours and hours before and after training and games and kicking this ball through the posts, just honing his skills and practicing his movement to the point where I know that he had trouble. I've read his biography; it's really good. He had trouble, holding down relationships, and um, his family life would get disrupted, and he had to, he had a lot of inner turmoil in his mind, and it obviously it helped him become a really good player and a really reliable kicker. But did it help him in the long term in terms of his mental health? Obviously, that's up for debate. I do believe that before the World Cup, he was at his worst in terms of the mental state, and the team psychologists had a choice to make whether they, tell him that you need to stop kick or doing all this kicking. It's putting you at risk of injury. Obviously, the repetition, and it's just going to make you mentally worse and worse. Or do they let him continue on, let him keep beating himself up, let him be depressed, potentially for the better of the team? Now, if they did say, let's try and get you some treatment, let's get you away from kicking, okay, that's morally, that probably is the right thing to do. Let's help this man out who's obviously struggling. But in the short term, it would have been very hard for him anyway, taking away this behavior that was so comforting to him in a way that his performance as a rugby player would massively deteriorate, and obviously the team would kind of relied on him a lot, especially for their points by kicking the goals. So they had a decision to make, and I believe they didn't actually give him treatment until after the World Cup. So they kind of just waited that month or so of the World Cup, and then helped him out afterwards because they thought that was the best thing to do, and it probably was at the time. With all the stress of the World Cup building, would you want to make a major change in your lifestyle as someone who definitely has undiagnosed OCD? Like, probably not. So that's perfectionism. Now, before we get into perfectionism, we'll talk about passion, and we'll see very early on that they're actually very linked. These two terms, passion and perfectionism. Now, I wanted to do my study just on perfectionism. However, my supervisor suggested that I do passion as well, and I had no interest in passion until I started looking into it. But to see if there's any relation between the two as well. So passion was defined as a strong inclination towards an activity that one likes, one finds important, and in which one invests a significant amount of time and energy. Now, we know that makes sense. Intuitively, that makes sense. The passionate activity is one that we feel like we need to survive. If we don't have this activity in our life, our mental health takes a hit, our physical health probably takes a hit as well as a result, and our stress levels rise, and our self worth perception probably decreases as well. Now, this guy, Robert Vallerand, came up with this idea of the dualistic model of passion. Now, writing a study about passion, you will come across this guy. He did basically every study in passion. He kind of created the scientific basis of it. And as a result, he became a very loved figure in my my journey to researching passion, because he helped a lot. Because without his papers, it would have been very difficult to write a paper. So he was the goat, and he came up with this dualistic model where on one side of the spectrum you have harmonious passion, and on one side you have obsessive passion. It's like a bell curve. There's two extremes. Most people are in the middle. Okay, so most people display kind of average levels or medium levels of both. Certain people are on the very end. Johnny Wilkinson, for example, will be on one end, and the opposites will be on the other in terms of the passion. Harmonious passion is characterized by a few things: autonomous internalization of the activity, which essentially means, I believe, you say when you start weightlifting, you love it so much, you start to, without even thinking about it, start telling people when you first meet them, oh, my name's Benedict, I'm 28 years old, and I'm a weightlifter. It becomes part of your personality. You internalize it as part of who you are. Now, on the opposite side, the obsessive passion side, you have a partial internalization, which essentially means I'm a weightlifter when I'm doing well. If I'm injured, like now, for example, or I'm, struggling with training and I'm not hitting any PBs, oh, I just train in the gym. I don't know. I don't consider myself a weightlifter. I'm only a weightlifter if I'm doing well. I'm only a weightlifter if I'm hitting PBs. That's kind of like this partial internalization. Now, secondly, the identity of the sport, or in this case, the sport, it could be anything, of the activity, let's say, is part of your identity without any contingencies, okay, in the harmonious side. Like we said, you're a weightlifter through and through, regardless of, you might have just bombed out at a competition, but you're still a weightlifter, On the obsessive side, as you can probably tell, if it is only partially internalized, it's driven a lot by self-esteem and social acceptance. If you've just bombed out at a big comp, say you bombed out at the British, it would probably save face if you were to tell people, oh yeah, I'm not actually a weightlifter, I just do it for a bit of fun, like it's not my whole idea, it's not my whole life. Because as soon as you admit to it being your whole life, even if it is, you've essentially failed because you've done a really bad performance. Now, the ego obviously takes a massive hit when that happens, and we need to understand that this self-esteem or social acceptance is on the obsessive side of passion and not on the harmonious side. So we know intuitively that most of us who are listening to this probably are passionate about weightlifting, and it's okay to fail. If we can still be a weightlifter and fail. Now, if I, for example, when I bombed out in the past, I still consider myself a weightlifter. I just had a bit of a terrible performance, and these things happen. If you're then suddenly so embarrassed and so ego hit that you feel the need to tell people, for example, because of some arbitrary, social acceptance norms, you it's not going to help your mental health, is it? If you're essentially, as you can see underneath, controlled by this urge. So on the harmonious side, you're always in control. You know, I do a PB snatch. Yeah, I'm a weightlifter. Um, yeah, I don't. I bomb out and I snap my elbow on my first attempt at the British. I'm still a weightlifter. These things happen. Sometimes on the obsessive side, you're more controlled by the urge to do the passion than you are. The passion controls you essentially. So it might be that, like Johnny Wilkinson, for example, if he, I know that when I read his book, there was times when he would miss really important appointments because he'd just be kicking because he couldn't control it. He was controlled by this kicking, this urge to kick a ball, and it's probably obviously it goes deeper than just kicking a ball, but he was so controlled by this that it would affect his life, and obviously that's when it's an issue. Whereas on the harmonious side, it doesn't mean you love it any less. It just means you are in control of it, and you can say, look, my brother's getting married today. I probably should go to that, and then I'll train after. Rather than, what, he's getting married at 1 p.m. That's usually when I train, and that's my peak time to train. I'm just going to train instead. That's an issue, obviously. Okay, so perfectionism. You'll start to see some real similarities. I want you to just think briefly that is this word perfectionism, it is it even bad? Is it even a bad thing? I would argue no. I would argue that it's actually, I've done another YouTube video on perfectionism and weightlifting, and it's I personally don't think it's bad. I think if it's in control, it's one of the best traits to have. And Silverman 2007 suggests that perfectionism only really visits those with the potential for excellence, and it's the most noteworthy characteristic associated with this kind of giftedness. And obviously, Johnny Wilkinson's prime example of that. Best kicker in the world at the time. I don't follow rugby anymore, so he might not. I don't know. Someone might have taken his records or whatever. But at the time, he was the goat. And if he wasn't perfectionist, he probably wouldn't have been. He probably just would have been a mediocre player, right? Um, and if it can be bad. If, like I said, similar to the passion, if it controls you, then yeah, it probably is bad. Is it always bad? I don't think so. Okay. I know, for example, that I've gone through bouts of having this kind of obsessive perfectionism side or this obsessive passion side. And I've had bouts of being a lot more harmonious, and probably now I'm a lot more harmonious. But in those times when I was obsessive, like, yeah, my mental health was probably in the bin, but my lifts probably doing pretty well. So there's a time and a place for both, and I think overall, as we'll see as we get towards the end, the harmonious side is more beneficial, but it's not always cut and dry. So as always, it depends. Perfectionism is not necessarily wanting a lift to look perfect. Everyone wants a lift to look perfect. It doesn't mean it's a perfectionism trait. Like any mental health issue, everyone gets sad. Doesn't mean you're depressed. Everyone gets anxious. Doesn't mean you've got anxiety disorders. It's not as simple as that. Okay. Now, this same dualistic model was proposed, where you have on one side perfectionist strivings, and on one side perfectionist concerns. Now, this seems really similar to the harmonious and obsessive passion, where, on that obsessive side, if I go back, you see this driven by self esteem or social acceptance on the obsessive side. It's really similar to that kind of concern over mistakes, parental criticism, expectations of others. It concerns you. You, as a perfectionist, I want to score 100% on this test because if I don't, people think I'm stupid, and the expectation people have for me will change. Whereas on the other side, you can be a perfectionist. I want to get 100% in this test, and I'm going to do it by being really organized and having really high personal standards. And that's striving for success. It's not worrying about the result, it's worrying a lot more about the process and aiming for that perfectionist performance or test score or kind of or music piece that you play or sing, and you're striving for that perfect performance. But you're okay if it doesn't happen. It's in harmony with your life. On the other side, if you're on that perfectionist concerns spectrum, as we said, most people are in the middle as a bell curve. But if you are on the perfectionist concerns side, you're more worried about the mistakes that you make. Now, and kind of the doubt, and you have doubts over the actions that you do. It controls you, essentially, is the best way to think about it. If you're on that side, it really controls you, and it becomes a part of your life that maybe isn't incredibly, I guess, beneficial or harmonious, especially mentally. Now, dualistic models. As I've said, both passion and perfectionism exist on a spectrum. There's a lot of it's like any kind of mental health. We get it a lot with like mental health stigma when people say like, "Oh yeah, I really like to wash my hands when I go to the toilet, so I must have OCD." It's like, no, that's just normal thinking. That's just what normal people do. That's the kind of reasonable. That's the reasonable action to what's just happened. If you go to the toilet, you probably do want to wash your hands just because germs. But having a mental health issue, let's say like OCD, probably means that if your compulsive behavior is hand washing, which it might not be, it might just not be that. It could be something completely different. If your compulsive behavior is hand washing, then you'll be hand washing a lot more. You won't be in control of it, and it will be hand washing to the extent of kind of skin damage and definite mental damage. So it's not a case of what's the word? Everyone with kind of emotions has mental health issues. I put the picture of Patrick Bateman just because it's like you can have. I like the film, but also you can American Psycho. You can have a mental health condition and not be an axe wielding serial killer. Okay, both ends of the spectrum exist in the same person, so it can exist in the same person. Most people exist in the middle, the less extreme end. Oops, yeah, the less extreme ends. So what did I do and find? Right, I did some interviews with many people, many weightlifters in the UK, and I found a lot of my stuff confirmed previous research in the sense of the characteristics I found of each type of person corresponded to previous research. So I interviewed, I forgot the exact number, but it was over 100. It was before I became a bit more involved in the weightlifting community, unfortunately. So if I did it now, I'd probably be able to have a much bigger sample. And I basically found the two ends of the spectrum. I plotted everyone's scores out on these graphs that I use. So on these standardized kind of tests that I used, which were the passion scale and the multidisciplinary perfectionism scale. And it basically plots, if you answer them, it plots out for you kind of where you are on the spectrum of obsessive or harmonious passion. And I graphed everyone's scores out. Obviously, most people are in the middle. And I picked the 6 most harmonious / adaptive perfectionism and the 6 most maladaptive / obsessive. So another term you can use, if I go back, for the perfectionism is, so this is the striving, so it's called adaptive perfectionism, and that's maladaptive perfectionism, where, again, it doesn't mean that this person is going to be a worse weightlifter than this person. It doesn't mean that. But in terms of maladaptive, it means kind of to your life. So yeah, a bit more adaptive, and it fits into your life a bit better. This, if I'm going to use harmonious and obsessive, I think, because people, well, yeah, I've used these terms. So when I made these, I got 6 people on the harmonious side and 6 people on the obsessive side. And I put them into groups called HPAP, which were harmonious, passion, adaptive perfectionism. And then the OPMP group, which was obsessive, passion, maladaptive perfectionism. If you scored highly on the harmonious passion, you scored highly on adaptive perfectionism. I don't think there was anybody that scored high in harmonious and low in adaptive, or high in harmonious, high in maladaptive perfectionism. I don't think anyone scored that. There might have been a few people that scored high in harmonious and then kind of middle of the line for perfectionism, but most people, if you scored high in harmonious, you scored high in obsessive, and if you scored high in adaptive, if you scored high in harmonious, you scored high in adaptive perfectionism. If you scored high in obsessive passion, you scored high in maladaptive perfectionism. So what I'll use the terms HPAP, which is essentially quote unquote the good side, and OPMP, which is essentially quote unquote the bad side. Confirmed previous research. Near perfect ABC mirrors. I always forget what this means. It's the cognitive behavioral therapy kind of actions, behaviors, cognitions. Attitudes, behaviors, cognitions. I think basically if you miss a lift, right, the first thing that happens is your attitude towards it might be, or your cognition. It might be, oh, I missed the lift because I am shit, and then the behavior is you get upset and you cry, and then the attitude is you then get, oh, I've got a bad attitude towards lifting now because it makes me cry. You know what I mean? So it mirrors the harmonious side all had similar behaviors, cognitions, attitudes. The obsessive side had similar, had their own, of again, like a spectrum on the other extreme. Okay. So, before we get on to these 2 points, let's talk briefly about some of when I did these interviews, asked them loads of questions. Some of them it was long interviews and I had to dictate them and whatnot and write them out. Let's talk about these groups that I found. So, when you do qualitative research, you have to have to make it quantitative and you have to objectify it a little bit. It's never perfectly objective, but these are some quotes here that the participants said, and then I made them into themes. So the 3 themes I found were human connection, passion, and self-esteem. Now these 3 themes were mentioned, discussed, or brought up by all 12 people in their own way. The questions weren't even necessarily led towards that. They just naturally started when I asked them about how they feel when they miss a lift, for example. These things would come up. So we're going to talk about human connection first. And on the harmonious side, one of the big thing was about finding a connection. Okay, so that human connection is about finding a connection. Someone said, I prefer to be around people in the gym. They've got a supportive network usually, albeit non-understanding. So their parents usually, they don't understand the sport, but they're really supportive. They are usually, when they go to the gym, they're usually welcomed by a very welcoming community. So a very nice community that's not going to be stressful. It's not going to be kind of toxic. And they've got a collaborative relationship with the current coach. Now, everyone who is coached by me knows that I'm not super autocratic. I mean, maybe I wish I was sometimes, but I'm not. I'm quite democratic. If you tell me I feel good, I want to max out, the likelihood is I'll say yes. On the other side, this human connection theme, on the obsessive side, instead of finding a connection, they rely on others. So they rely on other people. And one of the quotes was, I need him. And that was in relation to their coach. I need my coach. I need my coach. If you see here, holds coach in very high regard and needs them. It's not really a collaborative. It's very much like a grandiose kind of, this person is like a higher being, a higher authority, and I must do what he says. They had these bullet points are kind of sub themes, but they're pretty much, not fully, but pretty much direct mirrors of the HPAP side. So they had a non-supportive network, also non-understanding. So the parents, for example, if it was parents, also don't understand the sport because bloody no one understands what weightlifting is, who doesn't do it. But instead of the parents being supportive, the parents were non-supportive, and they would say things like, oh, why are you lifting? You're a girl. why are you doing this sport? It's dangerous. We had someone say, wouldn't you be better playing like bodybuilding, and these kind of things. But they're not that supportive. Now, interestingly, they also said that their community that they trained in was very welcoming, which goes a long way to suggest that the general of the people I interviewed, the weightlifting community that they train in, was really welcoming and really nice. The difference between the HPAP and the OPMP was the HPAP left it at that. They felt very welcome. The OPMP felt all six of them felt like, although it was a welcoming community, they had to fit in. They were more concerned of fitting in rather than just being themselves. They were more concerned with fitting in, which again comes into we've already talked about the social aspect of it. This was demonstrated very clearly by the OPMP group. And like I said, instead of being a collaborative relationship, they hold their coach in very high regard and needs them. Now, the second theme, passion, this was my favourite one. HPAP, a life enriched by passion. And someone said, I've managed to mould my life around weightlifting. Whereas on the flip side, the OPMP groups, the sub-theme was a life dictated by passion. And someone said, a direct quote, it dominates my life. It dominates my life. This sport that, let's be honest, no one cares about outside of this small weightlifting community, it dominates my life. And they were emotionally controlled by Olympic weightlifting. They planned their life around weightlifting, and their desire to train was based more on sacrificing necessities rather than on the adaptive side, kind of recognizing the benefits. Now, the second one is really useful, is really interesting. The HPAP group, they planned their weightlifting around their life. So a lot of the times, if they had, let's say, this wedding, they would just say, "Oh yeah, I'll do instead of training on Saturday when the wedding is, I'll just train on Friday and then I can go to the wedding." This person planned their life around weightlifting. No, no, no. Training's on Saturday. If you're getting married on Saturday, I'm not going. Or you get married on Sunday. That's what they would kind of act like. So they plan their life around weightlifting rather than, on the adaptive side, moving weightlifting around life. And the final theme is self-esteem. HPAP group it's very adaptive self-improvement was the theme of their self-esteem. They were working on building something brick by brick. They were very competing against oneself, process-driven, adaptive behaviors. OPMP, their kind of desire, their kind of evaluation of their self-esteem was based purely not on adaptive self-improvement, but needing to retain dignity. Oh, someone said, I look like I don't know what I'm doing. I'm comparing myself and competing against others. I'm outcome/ego driven, and I'm downplaying my own achievements. Because all of these things are ego related. So if I miss a lift and I'm worried that, the adaptive person might think, oh, okay, let's think about, I'm building something brick by brick. The process takes time. Maybe I pulled my arms early, for example. Whereas this person, as soon as they miss, they think, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing. We can all rationally look at that and think if we miss, if we see someone miss in a gym, we don't give a fuck. We don't care what we just think, oh, it's just a part of the sport. It is what it is. Everyone misses. But there's some people that when they miss themselves, they then suddenly think, oh my God, everyone thinks that I don't know what I'm doing. When if you're on the flip side and you watch the person opposite you miss, you don't think that at all, do you? No one does. Or you'd be a terrible person. So why would we think it for ourselves? Now, the reason is it's very ego based, and this person is very outcome in driven. That their whole purpose is to beat someone else, competing against others, and their whole purpose is to get, like, let's say, a certain number or a certain, I guess maybe technique or achievement. Whereas this person just wants to beat their best. They just want to beat their best lifts and progress themselves. They don't really care about, they can be happy watching other people and they can have friendly competition, but they're not going to let it get them down. And this person on the OPMP side, this downplaying achievements thing, is a strategy that the maladaptive people will use to actually make themselves look better. So they might put their all into this. They might train as hard as they can for 20 weeks into this competition, and they might do really well. And people might say, "Look, oh, you did really well." And the first thing they might say is, "Oh, yeah, I didn't really try." Just and maybe they can lie about, "Oh, I didn't really try that hard," just so it makes them look even better. And obviously, we know that this is so they can then not even feel better about themselves, but they can, I guess, receive more compliments and think that their social standing rises. Where the adaptive group will be very process driven, and if they have this huge performance, they might do some adaptive behaviors like, I don't know, take a week off and enjoy it and go on holiday or something, and kind of enjoy the moment while it lasts, and think what's next, kind of thing. So those are some of the characteristics of the two groups, and you might recognize yourself in some of them. You might recognize someone else in some of them. What I would say is these aren't set in stone. So what I found is, so I'm talking about this sustainability group. What I found was the 6 people who were in this group, the adaptive side, had all been lifting for over 5 years and were national champions, international lifters. We had a world champion masters lifter. On this side, they were all very new to the sport, as in under, I want to say under a year, or everyone had to be lifting over 6 months. Yeah, so they were about a year, I think, all of these. I'm just trying to think of who they were at the time. They were all a year lifting, right? So, what this doesn't tell us, because it's not a longitudinal study, these 6 people in the adaptive group, were they maladaptive when they first started and just naturally, with time, switched over to this side? We don't know. Secondly, do these people on the maladaptive side, do they still lift now? Or is their sustainability low and have they already quit because of the ego involvement of OPMP? Over time, that will become overbearingly difficult because you will start to realize how miserable it makes you. So the ability of as in the actual lifting ability of this group was significantly higher, but obviously they've been lifting a lot more. Does that speak to the mental kind of personality side of them, or does it suggest that their harmonious passion and adaptive perfectionism just kept them in the sport for longer? We all know that weightlifting is a sport that whoever is in it the longest usually wins. And if you can outlast people, it's a sport where, if you're in it for 10 years, you're probably going to be pretty good. If we can make someone into HPAP group, then their chance of success is going to be massively improved, because they will not only stay in the sport longer, most likely, but they will they'll enjoy it more, and they'll have these adaptive behaviors. So obviously these questions I can't answer because this is not a longitudinal study. This was a snapshot study where I had these people, and I can't necessarily compare them in terms of where they are now, because I'm not having follow-ups. It was just a master study. I wish I could, but I did not have the facilities to do that. The one thing we can kind of infer is, if we were to try to make someone HPAP, we would potentially, if we were to just take this human connection as an example, we would try to make their network supportive. That was the first thing that these guys have. These guys have a non-supportive network. So maybe we talk to the parents and say, look, fucking buck up. Your kid loves this sport. Just help them, be supportive, please. We will also, for example, this bottom one is something that I need to do, obviously, as the coach, is have a collaborative relationship with the person. But also, if I were to, or if, maybe someone who's watching this as a coach notices that one of their athletes is very, kind of holds them in an unbelievably high regard, it might be worth having that conversation with them and trying to move them over to this more collaborative side. And if we can just start, giving these OPMP guys some of these characteristics, maybe hopefully there'll be enough characteristics on this side that their whole thought process will change over to this harmonious side, and really that's what we want, because like it's not all about who's going to be the best lifter. A lot of the time, it's just about like let's just let people have as much fun as possible. But we want to keep people in the sport as long as possible if they're enjoying it. And the only way they're going to enjoy it, and fortunately, is on this side. They're not going to enjoy it here. They're not going to stay in the sport very long. They're either going to quit. They're either going to get injured by um, um, like over intensity, and then kind of give up, because you have to understand, if you giving up is actually also ego protective, because you don't ever get challenged. You can say, oh, I quit because I I just couldn't be asked anymore. Someone will say to you like, oh, well then, and then you could say, well, I could have snatched 100, but I just couldn't be asked, so I gave up. That's ego protective, because you're not put in that theater where you get evaluated and you get judged. Now, obviously, people move on from the sport and they leave the sport for a myriad of reasons. That's just one example. Not everyone who leaves the sport is doing it for that reason, but that is someone who was, if they were extremely OPMP, that was probably going to be one of the reasons why, if they would quit. So we want to try and get them over to this harmonious side so they can stay in the sport for as long as possible, achieve all they want to achieve, and be happy doing it, which is the main thing. And then the final thing was any questions, but obviously this is online, so no, there's not. These are some of the references, and if anyone does have any questions, obviously they can message me whenever. If you comment on this video, it probably won't get seen because I don't check the YouTube. But yeah, if you wanted to have any questions, please let me know.